What is your name and where are you from?
Okay, my name is Stefan Schnitzer, and I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
What are you doing in Panama?
Well, I do research in Panama. I do research on how tropical forests regenerate, how they grow, what mechanisms maintain diversity. You know, there's a lot of diversity in tropical forests, and we study how that diversity is maintained and how the forests are changing over time.
What is the big question in your research currently?
Well, we have lots of big questions. One of them is, why doesn't a single tree species displace all the rest? Why are there hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tree species that coexist in tropical forests? And we're investigating why that is, and we have some pretty good answers so far. But another important question is, how do trees and lianas compete? And lianas are woody vines, and they compete really intensely with trees, and they reduce tree growth, and they increase tree mortality. They basically kill a lot of trees, and we're trying to determine what the competitive interaction is, how big the effect is. And this is important because lianas and trees are changing in tropical forests due to global change.
What do you expect to find?
What do I expect to find? Well, that's a good question. I mean, we know what is happening. Right now we're quantifying how large the effect is. We know that there's really strong competition among different plant types in tropical forests, and we're trying to actually determine how strong it is so we can quantify it. So then, when lianas continue to increase in tropical forests, which they are increasing compared to trees, what will happen is we will be able to tell you what that means and why it's meaningful and what effect that will have on functioning of tropical forests, like how much carbon they store. Because tropical forests store a lot of carbon. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air and they store it in the wood. And when they're not storing carbon, that means that carbon goes back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And so tropical forests have a huge impact on the global carbon cycle. And global carbon is an important component of climate change.
How do you collect your data?
Oh, well, we collect data in a number of ways. We measure the growth of lianas and trees over time. We measure the rate of water flow through the trunks of trees. So if you look at competition, you can tell who's competing more strongly with one group than another by looking at how fast water is moving through the trunk, because that's a measure of the photosynthesis of a plant. So if we do studies like, we'll put these probes into a trunk of a tree, and the probes are measuring how fast the water's moving, and then we'll cut the lianas from the tree and we'll look at the change in this sap flow velocity, or the flow of water, and we'll say, aha, if that flow of water increases, that means there's strong competition. And if we do that across a lot of species, we can say, okay, species A may not compete very strongly with lianas, but species B and C will, and so we can determine that.
Do you always find what you expect, and what happens when you don't get the answer you expected?
Well, the fun of science is actually finding what you didn't expect. I mean, that's where it gets interesting, because we walk through these forests and we work a lot in these forests, and we understand to a great degree what's happening. But when our data actually don't match our expectations, that makes us say, wait a minute, what's going on here? What really is happening in tropical forests that would cause something that seems disjunct to what our observations are? And that does happen occasionally. And sometimes we're doing research on one thing, like liana tree competition, and then we come back and we continue our research and we realize, wait a minute, the forests are changing in ways that we hadn't even considered when we started the study, but the study is giving us data that help us determine what those changes are.
How do you formulate question, and what makes a good question for science and research?
Well, formulating questions can be very difficult, actually, because you have to know what questions were asked before you. And so a lot of our questions now are easy to formulate because they're based on our previous questions. So after a while, when you're doing some research, you can say, okay, we answered question A, but what that does is it means that we now have question B and C to answer, which are based on question A. So initially, what we do is we come up with a question that we find really interesting and that we hope the rest of the world finds interesting, such as, how do lianas and trees compete? Or do they compete at all? Because initially people thought, oh, lianas don't compete with trees. And the reason why our research is interesting is because we're showing that they do compete with trees, and they compete really, really intensely, and that matters. If it didn't matter, well, then we would have answered that question and we'd say, okay, let's think of a new question.
How do you share your results?
Well, we share our results with interviews like this one. We also write a lot of papers that we publish in scientific journals, and we do interviews with reporters to try to give our information and our findings to the general public. And we talk to people as often as possible. Sometimes we just stop people on the street and make them listen to our stories.
Why is your research important?
It's important because it's helping us understand how tropical forests work and how they function. I mean, they're really, really complex ecosystems, and right now there's still a lot of open questions that we haven't been able to investigate, and not just me and my research group, but research groups around the world. And so we don't know how these forests operate in great detail because of the complexity of interactions. And so our research is helping us clarify how tropical forests work and how they function and how they regenerate and what maintains diversity and those kinds of questions.